guy, Mike Stanley. He's a
Welcome everyone. Today
tricky
we
guy.
have our another new episode and we will discuss on PodWay sustainable transportation infrastructure. We have our world famous speaker, Mr. Mike, Professor David Smith. We have Mr. Andreas. We have Professor Ron and Mr. Donald will join. So I think Mr. Mike has presentation. So he can share his presentation. Then other speakers, I know they have their own innovation, they also can share their presentations or their comments on today's presentation. First, I would like to give chance Mr. Mike.
Great, thanks. So we're going to be talking about transportation infrastructure and specifically a PRT system called the PodWay. So why don't I start that now? Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my screen. Okay. So let's start with the problems. The problems are relatively well known, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on them. It's the congestion, the crashes, the high land use, the pollution and health impacts, and the resiliency and the cost of our existing road and rail transportation systems. These are some of the ways that people are trying to address those problems: electric vehicles, autonomous shuttles and cars, electric scooters, bicycles, sharing, bus rapid transit, urban tunnels, air taxis, electric streetcars, high-speed rail. In the United States, public transit is used for less than 1% of all trips. So the question has to be asked, if a lot of people say we need to have multimodal, well, why is public transit so unpopular? And I give an example of Portland, Oregon, where I overlaid all the light rail stations as red dots. And then I'm going to show you just the major roadways in yellow. And if you can see the amount of roadways, even the major arterial roadways dominate and provide full coverage, where the mass transit system is really designed for commuters in specific locations. What people want is a car-like experience. They want direct, comfortable, private party trips anywhere at any time. So I submit that buses and trains can never be popular, and even if you doubled transit use, you'd have no significant impact. I'd also like to point out that many cities with the best, that are considered to have the best public transit in the world, also have the worst congestion. So the notion that we can use public transit to solve congestion, I don't think is a viable approach. And I'd say public transit is dead, or at least conventional public transit, but long live public transit, because I think podways are the future of public transit. Now, if we look at a car-centric multimodal mess, the cars, the buses, the trains, what if we can have a single mode that doesn't take up any space, but can provide what you now have from all the other modes? So a podway has the convenience of cars, the capacity of trains, the efficiency of bicycles, the speed of flying, the safety of commercial aircraft at lower cost and risk than roadways. Now, it's not just for passengers, it's also for freight. There are different pod types, 2, 4, and 6 passenger pods, as well as specialty pods and freight pods for pallets and liquids and refrigeration and bulk goods. There's many different podway types. So bridges, tunnels, going over existing roadways, even within buildings, high speed. So many different ways of going the infrastructure itself. Our pilot was installed in 2001 outside of Boston, Massachusetts. Here's a short clip of the installation process and some of the testing that we've done on that. So we're ready to move forward with projects. The pods go down to ground level for boarding. So you're boarding it like you would a car, and then it has a vertical lift that brings it up and then merges onto the main line. This is our prototype carbon fiber pod. It has a door on each side. This is like a 2.5 passenger. So traditional infrastructure is what we call heavy civil. And what we're talking about is light civil, or orders of magnitude lighter weight. So it's very low capital costs, very fast construction, no disruption during construction or operations, very little visual impact, no significant environmental impact, light vehicles, and solar powered. So what we've done is gotten podways to cost less than roadways and easier to deploy than roadways. And so we submit that the podway projects are the lowest risk alternative. It's lower risk than even bus electrification, or lower risk than autonomous shuttles or light rail or bus rapid transit or PRT, or expanding the roadways, or even just this, not doing anything, just the status quo. It's lower risk than that. So we have partners that are reputable and experienced and can provide all the bonded guarantees. We work with a large Capgemini Engineering, which has done a lot of automated systems and high-speed rail and other automated shuttle systems. The system itself is like an electric vehicle in that there's a battery and 4 wheels and electric motors running on a flat rail. And then the guideway can have utilities. There's many different types and forms of junctions depending upon the space requirements and the capacity requirements. Many different forms of stops, reversing, sidings, parking. You can see sort of some basically the bottom of the pod would be where you would have, it would go over existing vehicles. So take your large tractor trailers, and the pod bottom would be above that, kind of like at urban bridge height. The energy is produced by solar film and panels on the guideway, as well as vertical axis wind turbines that are feeding a battery storage system that then is used to charge ports or charge the pods that have stopped offline. And so the guideway itself can protect utility lines. So we offer utility relocation for electrical and telecommunications cabling systems. So that can be put within the guideway. And so we call this moving to zero. There's many different types of moving to zero. You know, the most important, probably the congestion, no waiting, no pollution, no crashes, no land use, no government funding. And when you have that, it's benefiting a lot of areas, not just transportation. It's healthcare, housing, water, tourism, sanitation, manufacturing, food security, education, jobs, and the environment. So we create a system that has equitable and affordable fares using a fair fare formula. That's 75% of these fares are capped by the fair fare formula, and it's based on median income. It is, as I mentioned, 100% privately funded. There's no government funding or subsidies or guarantees. And how can it be funded privately? Well, it's profitable because it has low cost of capital and operations, and there's no land acquisition. Every project includes a pilot, and the pilot is installed prior to signing the concession agreement. So we have a podway with 2 stops and installed on site. And then we have a phased project implementation, and all the major construction is done within 12 to 18 months. So our offer is we eliminate congestion and crashes. We provide a service that's sustainable, accessible, equitable, and resilient. We don't need any land. It has no disruption. There's no government funding or subsidies. We're creating good jobs. The government is getting revenue from 5% of gross revenue. And what podways need is the rights of way alongside roadways and a long-term concession agreement and the associated licenses and permits. So we submit this is the lower cost and lowest risk of any alternative. So there's no financial risk, no project risk, no technical risk, no political risk, and lower risk than the status quo. And so to move forward, there's a MOU outline that you can see, and then we go and do the pre-development work, which ends in the concession signing before we start implementation. So that's a summary, and we have feasibility studies. There's many different proposals that have been done for countries and cities around the world, and now I guess we're going to open up for questions about TransitX and the podway system.
Thank you, Mr. Mike. Professor Ron, I know you are expert of sustainable transportation infrastructure. Do you want to give any presentations or you only want to give comments? Can you unmute yourself?
Sure. I'd be happy to show a few pictures here. Oh, hi, Don. Donald Stanley has
Hi.
joined. Yay. So, Mike Stanley just gave his presentation talking a little bit about the different frameworks into which um, the podcar technology comes into play. One thing I thought I might do just to start off, a couple of years ago, we did a research project with the Moneta Transportation Institute at San Jose State. And what we looked at there was the notion of connecting a university campus with its athletic campus, which, for better or for worse, is a couple of miles away uh, from each other. And so students who want to take a class in, um, say, tennis or golf or soccer or whatever, they have to get to this other campus. And there's a shuttle bus, which takes a very long time because it's tied into traffic. Even though it's a short distance, it's quite challenging. So we looked at this, and then subsequently, we started looking at a variety of use cases. And I think it might be handy just to give people a quick overview by showing what some stations might look like and what a network might look like in different settings. So if I can figure out how to do my uh, video here, let me share my screen. Let's see how that works out. I'm hoping that, there we go. Can everybody see my screen now? Can you see my
No.
screen?
Not yet. No, we can't.
Let's see
No.
here. This is, oh, I see. I have to make a selection here. There we go. I think, let's try this. Now, what do you see?
It's coming up.
Oh, good. Excellent. So this shows an overview of our system. We have, as Mike Stanley talked, there's a chance of doing this with solar panels along the entire guideway and as well above the station, which you see over here in the background. And below, in this case, we envisioned that we would be compatible with and running in parallel with existing public transit, which in San Jose is generally bus lanes, as well as cars and pedestrians and the like. There may be many situations where we would eliminate that, but that's a different story. Now, showing what this looks like underneath the canopy, you see here that the guideway has a fork in the road, a point at which go off the main line and thereby come to the station for exchange of passengers. And this demonstrates the key point, which is that you have the ability to continue on your journey as compared to being with a situation where, like in a railroad, everybody has to come to a stop while only a few people get on and off. This has a great deal to do with the capacity of the system. That was we'll go briefly through that again. Here's a layout of an industrial park. Interesting, on the lower right, you can see that you can bring a pod right into the location of a building and not have to be unrelated to that. You don't have to walk across the street to get to your destination. You just get right out at the building itself. Now we show in places like big game parks, or even if you're not a tourist operation like we see here, but there are many parts of the world where wild animals are being challenged. The Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, there's a new train called the Train Maya, and it is interfering with the wildlife, and the environmental community is extremely unhappy with the way that this is going. So with this system, you rise above the canopy and you do not have to have any interference with the wildlife that exists. We show here what it could be like if a flooding condition. On the right, you have a platform, which could be a floating platform that would rise and lower according to the amount of flooding going on, and then take the stairways up to the destination, up to the loading platform, and people go on to a destination, even in the context of something like that. We've also shown how it can be used in informal settlements where the roadways are very challenged with uh, congestion and the encroaching of street vendors and such. This would make a huge difference. And as Mike Stanley pointed out, because these systems are designed economically, the fares for uh, people in poverty is just as much a possibility as for comfort of wealthy people who just want to get there quicker. Here's a warehouse scene. On the left, you have workers coming in on a people pod, and on the right, you have pods being loaded with freight to go into town and make deliveries, perhaps. Here's an airport. Again, both types you have in the foreground, uh, a pod car system loading baggage into the plane or taking baggage out. And on the left up here, you see where passengers are coming into this terminal or leaving the terminal. Here's the station design. Just to give a sense, here's a larger station with people arriving at a game. Here's makes the note that we have the ability to work with bicycles and wheelchairs and pets and so forth in the vehicles. So the station could be designed coming down closer to the ground or even coming all the way down to the ground so that people could go on and off at grade or
boring.
in a building like this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's enough for now.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 others.
Oh, let's see now. I think I've got to figure out a way to. There we go.
David,
Transportation.
Okay. Now I request Professor David Smith. You are a tech analyst. So, what is your input or feedback?
Well, Sharif, thank you so much. Sharif, thank you so very much on this one. You know, I love these different pods. And what I love about this is we've seen this technology being used numbers of times around the world and around the country, and with various success or not. You know, in Irving, Texas, in Las Colinas, there was an experiment back 15 years ago, maybe a little longer, of using pods to interconnect all the office buildings, all of the hotels, the convention center there, and others, to pull it together. And what was very interesting about it is, while it was marginally successful, it fell into disrepair and was shut down. And we've seen those experiments in many different places. And, you know, part of it is what is different now, what is changing now. And I think this might be a time to go back and do it because, you know, if I go back and look at the recent past, the pandemic has, for example, accelerated numerous forces that were already in play when it began, and it has changed as a transformational area many of the basic things we do. And you know, for example, we know it accelerated digitalization. It accelerated flexible working models. It accelerated telemedicine, and many other things that have been introduced, and I don't think are going back. But one area that really deserves more attention because of its long-term implications on sustainability is the transport infrastructure. And the two approaches to pods we've seen are great examples of that. Worldwide, if I go back and look at some statistics in the Global Infrastructure Outlook, more than $2 trillion of transport infrastructure investments will be needed each year until 2014. This is both to support what is already there and also to fuel economic development. And this is globally, and it's particularly as you begin to see things like rapid urbanization, really an increased demand freight services, particularly as the world, because of the pandemic, is totally shifting our view on manufacturing, with more and more manufacturing being brought back to the countries instead of concentrated in a few countries internationally. We also begin to see that the COVID-19 responses with stimulus plans, they're putting pressure on stakeholders to really step at the pace of infrastructure development, such as the American 21st Century Act, which had significant monies in it to uh, spend on infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, fixing existing, building new, and looking at alternative approaches such as we see there. And we're seeing that going. And you begin to look at places in Europe, for example, the pandemic temporarily pushed people out of cities in Europe into more rural areas. And, there are some signs that point to that while many are going back to the urban areas, but corporations and universities or things are still grappling with when do professionals, when do people return to in person, and how does the infrastructure change? I'm going to be a little selfish here, guys, in that I live in Austin, Texas, for those of you on the panel who don't know. And during the pandemic, God, Austin traffic almost went away. And it was so easy to get to places. Um, but we see all these experiments. The last few weeks here in Austin, we've had the South by Southwest conference, and one of the large tracks in it last year and this year has been transportation and transportation infrastructure. And so we've had on our streets here the last several weeks uh, 5 or 6 different brands of fully autonomous cars. And those were very good, and I enjoyed going through them and doing them. But what I think I can see, and I will put on the table here, Sharif, is that to really deal with sustainable transportation infrastructure, it's going to take a total village to do it. And I love the podways. I've loved what Ron showed with it and what Mike showed. But I think it's going to take a more defined approach to make a difference, and also looking at ways to use different types of fuels, different types of batteries, different types of sustainable ways to make them possible. Um, One of the panels that I was in during South by was really interesting because in talking about transportation options for sustainable infrastructure, they made the point that, we're going away from hydrocarbon based transportation. But then you see things like biodiesel, electricity, ethanol, hydrogen, natural gas, propane, solar power, which is a form of electrical. Uh, you're seeing dramatically advances in fuel cells. I was really impressed that as a way to look at where we're headed with electric vehicles, there were 2 different organizations there with having their hydrogen powered cars there and actually working and driving across the streets of Austin. And we'll see that because, today electric vehicle sales are about 4% of the total market, and we think by 2030 that's going to increase to around 40%. But the problem with electric vehicles is even though there have been tremendous uh, growth in the last couple of years, the infrastructure investment in charging stations is still going to be tremendous to support it. And you've seen states like California banning the sale of internal combustion engines by 2035, and that fleet purchases have to be 100% electric by then. You see these changes really accelerating and beginning to move and beginning to look at other things. And the Paris Agreement uh, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals and others are going to try to push that. But then we look at the other sides. And Sharif, on your program, we've talked a lot about the circular economy. And one of the challenges we have today with a lot of these transportation approaches is that it doesn't work well in a circular economy viewpoint. For example, electric vehicles. Um, Once the battery dies in the current versions of electric vehicles, it's going to cost more to put a new battery in many of these cars than the vehicle's worth. So,
David, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to find out. So, what is the point in regards to podcasts then? To what we're doing to the suspended vehicles that we're showing here, which is
well,
public
it's
transportation systems using electric vehicles and solar
well,
power.
and Andrews, it's a whole sustainable transportation infrastructure. And that's part of what the topic is here as well, is the sustainable transportation infrastructure. And like
So,
I said
is that
before,
good?
podways are part of it, but it's a small part. I love the graphic that Mike showed at the start, traffic routes to the one city, and looked at where the public rail transports are. And the podways have a much smaller footprint today than public rail transports. So my point is, Andrews, is even though the podway is part of that solution, it's a small part of it. And that
But
I
isn't that
think
the purpose of having sessions like this? Is to discuss should it not become a bigger part of it?
well, if you'd listen to what I had said, is I did say it's a part of the hybrid mix that is going to be part of the solution.
Yeah, that's
And
not
and and that it needs to be part of the solution, but it's a
that's
hybrid
not the
mix.
case. That's not the case.
It's a hybrid mix.
That's not the case.
Uh, Professor David Smith, you finish your sentence.
No,
Then
no,
I want to give chance.
no, Dr. Sharif, I think I'm finished with it.
Okay,
The
okay,
future
Mr.
the future of
Then let me
sustainable
go.
transportation infrastructure is going to be a hybrid future.
That's
And
not.
Okay,
if I look at every futurist who talks about sustainable transportation infrastructure, that's the conclusion of everyone I've seen.
Correct. And
And
there's
and I believe it is an accurate projection when you look at the drivers and constraints, when you look at the way the world is beginning to use resources, and particularly when you do stakeholder analysis and look at the stakeholders which are driving the underlying decisions on the sustainable transportation infrastructure, it's going to be a hybrid approach. The
that's not the
stakeholders for particular cases are not strong enough for it to go to full substitution when you begin to apply it. This type of technology is in a model that's called a Fisher-Price model, which has been used for hundreds of years to look at technology adoption. And when I begin to look at this in a technology adoption curve, it's going to be part of it, but is not going to go to a full substitution. So, Dr. Sharif, thank you.
thank you, Mr. Mike. You want to add any point, Mr.
Um,
Mike?
yes, you can hear me. So he's wrong, and here's why he's wrong. Um, so I agree that a lot of the futurists are saying it's a multimodal future. That's what you hear about. Unfortunately, all of them are talking about large capacity vehicles, which we know cannot scale either on the low end. Second, he's not. We have a single mode solution now. 95% of our trips are in a car on the roadways. So we have an example of a unimodal system, and if you have a substitution where the new mode is more efficient, lower cost, because you can have, so right now we have the government is funding the infrastructure for transportation. But just like the telecommunication systems, if you have it where a private company with private funding can provide the is doing profitable projects, now you can have trillions of dollars be applied to entire systems, and you cannot have a partial coverage system. So when you have a full coverage network over a city and you're 3 times faster and 7 times cheaper than cars or any other mode, people are going to be in their cars and saying, well, why am I riding in a depreciating asset where I see these pods go straight overhead? So it's not the case that it will be a multimodal future, although I recognize that that's what everyone's preconceived notions are, but that's not the case because of your network effects. It's kind of like saying 15 years ago when we had all these different social networks, MySpace and Napster and Friendster and Facebook, where they said, oh, well, there's going to be a mix of all these people. And that's not the case. The Facebook had a model that basically everything else was removed. So we will see a very fast transition to something that's better, cheaper, and faster that can be privately financed, and you won't see a multimodal future. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Donald.
Well, it's very, oops, 1 second here. Let me make sure. Yep. Well, I think that part of the problem is the psychology of people, that people love their cars, and it's part of their identity. Like I know, and especially you go to Southern California and you know, when people get to know each other, they ask questions about people like, oh, where are you from? You know, where'd you go to school? What do you do? What's your job? And one of the questions that people ask, at least in some places, is what kind of a car do you drive? I mean, it's like, in order to establish what kind of a person you have to know what kind of a car they drive. And I know people who just, they are their cars. I mean, that's who they are. I mean, they work all day to pay for their car, and it's just, you know, it's just them. So I think that the transitioning will be a little bit, will take a little bit of time. But I agree with Mike that, you know, ultimately, you know, I have a very, very, very low opinion of cars. If I can, I don't ride in them at all. I walk everywhere or take public transportation or do something else. And I use them as little as possible. So I use Uber or something like that when I absolutely need to. And if you think about like a city, think of how much space is wasted by parking lots and roads and things like that. With pods, I kind of see that we might see, at least kind of the experience we're having, is that it's a little bit like what happened with cell phones. In countries that didn't have a copper infrastructure, like in the United States was very slow to adopt cell phones. So other countries in the world were using cell phones before the United States. I remember going to Finland, and you know, cell phones were very expensive and rare in the United States. But I went to Finland, and everyone was using cell phones in early 2000s. And one of the reasons is because they didn't have copper. I mean, it was a very sparsely populated country, and people were it would be really very expensive to lay copper lines to everybody's house, and it was just too expensive. And so putting cell towers was way cheaper. And so they just went immediately to cell phones, and then a lot of countries just hadn't done it. So India and China and places like that just did not develop it. So they went straight to cell phones and never went to the intermediate step of having copper wires. And if you think about what the expense of a car is, one of the main expenses is the roads. And like here in Silicon Valley, a square meter of Silicon Valley costs so incredibly much that it's mind-boggling. I mean, literally, it's just outrageous. And so if you want to put a road from one place to another, you know, people own that land. And so you have to buy that land and destroy what's on it and put a road there. And that is, I think Ron can give me an accurate number of how much that costs per yard or mile or something like that, but it's hundreds of millions of dollars per mile. And it's so incredibly expensive and so fraught because nobody wants it to happen. There's all kinds of ways that you can stop it by lawsuits and things like that. So the transportation of pods, which go above above things and can actually be kind of cool and attractive, and they're electric, so they're not anywhere near as noisy as cars, make them a lot more possible for transportation. I don't have the exact numbers on this, and I don't think anybody does, but there was a very recent study that somebody did where they did this beautiful three-dimensional map of how much tax revenue an area generated for a city versus how much it costs to support that area of the city. And the central cores of cities basically support the suburbs. So the suburbs cost the city more than the cities make from that. So suburbs are a net loss for cities. They actually cost more than the central core of the city. And so the model that we have in the United States of having central cores for cities and then roads where we drive people out to houses it's a very bad model, and
Thank you, Mr. Donald. Yes. Actually, we have other speakers and we have time shortness, and we have to give opportunity to everyone. So
obviously,
thank you. Thank you, Mr. Andreas. I'm sorry because I need to give you opportunity. So, what do you think about the sustainable transportation's infrastructure?
Thank you, Dr. Sharif. I appreciate the opportunity. I think the best way we can describe this whole thing, this phase we are in right now, is as Don said, cell phones. If you look at what happened with the mobile technology, cell phone technology, digital communication was not something that was invented by the cell phone technology. It was there. Someone applied it to cell phones, and then cell phones took over. The same thing with electric cars. Electric cars is not something new. We always had cars, and we always had electric cars. It took someone to say, but it's illogical that this is the next phase. So Elon Musk didn't invent the electric car. He simply said, if we apply that to the needs of modern society, it makes much more sense. And sun is taking off. The same thing with mobile technology. The same thing's happened with the internet. The internet in the beginning was merely a communication device or platform. Right now, it's become the basis of absolutely everything we do. Now, what you're going to find with transportation and sustainable transportation is exactly the same things happening right now. Is people need to move around without in a sustainable manner. That's now possible. It's always been possible, but people are now starting to apply it. They don't want to drive their own cars. That's why self-driving technology is suddenly jumping up everywhere. If you start combining solar or renewable energy fixed guideway transportation, not railway, fixed guideway transportation, which simply means you separate the movement layer from the ground. Like with a metro system, it goes underground. It's a grade separated fixed guideway. You can go underground or you can go above ground, but it's a fixed guideway with renewable energy, with electric vehicles and self-driving technologies. All of these things are there, but suddenly they are coming together and they're addressing the needs of a new society, a society that wants to move on demand and not in big buses and trains on a schedule. They want to move on demand. They want to move at low cost. Cities don't want to subsidize this anymore. They need it to be affordable. They need it to be with renewable energy. They need it to run 24 hours a day. They need it to be automated. All of those things are coming together. So this is not something we've invented. This is a revolution that's starting, the same as with the mobile technology, the same as with electric vehicles, the same as with private rocket enterprises, for instance. It's not something they invented. It's that the world has moved on, and now technology is catching up. And all we are doing in this sustainable, automated, self-driving, on-demand public transportation era is we are addressing the needs of a society that's moved on. And I think you will see a lot of this happening soon. That's why I differ from what David said. This is not something that's going to replace everything else. It's becoming a natural phenomena that is addressing the needs of a modern society, and it will start happening everywhere because there's a huge demand for it, and it wasn't necessarily there 5 years ago and 10 years ago, and the technology wasn't necessarily there 5 years ago and 10 years ago. It is there now, and the world is moving that way in any case. We are simply following what the world is demanding. If that makes sense.
Thank you, Prof. Yeah, Professor Ron.
Me?
Professor Ron, yes.
Okay. Well, you see the photo, the painting in the background. If we had X-ray vision like Superman, we would see my neighbors' activity, and it turns out they're packing their bags to go to Barcelona. And I just got a text message a couple hours ago from my neighbor. She says, and one of the things I love about Barcelona is the walkability and its public transportation system. We do not intend to have a car there. Now, cities like Barcelona or Paris or New York or San Jose, everybody's talking about smart cities. What's smart about a city that allows 2-ton monsters to float around? I don't care whether it's a Tesla, Uber, Google, smart cars. There's nothing smart about human beings allowing 2-ton anything like a rhinoceros or a water buffalo or an elephant for that matter running around on the streets. And in the past, going back 100 years, we all look upon Henry Ford and Benz and Diesel, those innovators, as heroes. But that effort led to a technology which, in the United States alone, brought us to a point where, with a lot of safety measures, we dropped about 10, 15 years ago to 30,000 people dying a year. And we take that for granted as, oh, well, it just has to be. Well, I've lost several family members to drunk drivers and to careless drivers, to, in one case, to a faulty vehicle, the vehicle that became famous by being the car that was dangerous at any speed, the Corvair. So we know of these things. We just take it for granted that there's a certain loss. We got down to 30,000, but in the last 10 years, it's gone back up again, and more people on the ground as pedestrians and bicyclists are dying in traffic as compared to before. So I see that we do not look at anybody who's putting smart cars with autonomous driving, any of that stuff, putting those at the same level as Andre described it, where humans exist. We're not birds. We don't fly. We're not gophers and moles and snakes that go underground. We're at this level. This is our living surface. For anybody to violate that, I don't care what it is. If you're going 30, 40, 50 kilometers an hour on that ground with 2 tons, you're not smart. It just can't be. There's no smart city with the automobile at grade. So, as Andres pointed out, we're shifting. And as we move to this new era, we're going to see our cities become livable again. Right now, if I go to downtown San Jose, which is not too far from here, it's like being in a battlefield. It's noisy. There's cars roaming around. If you get out on the streets, you're taking the life in your hands. And the only thing that separates me from these cars going by is typically a curb that's about this high. What's that all about? That's nuts. So one of the trends that we read about, David Smith, you mentioned that this is going to be a hybrid. Well, there is a push in that direction. They're called complete streets. So these people, complete idiots in the planning world and in transportation planning, have decided that a complete street consists of a place over here where you can walk, a place in here where you can go 2 directions on a motorcycle or a bicycle. Then there's 2 directions with a car, a truck, a cement mixer, 200 passenger bus, articulated bus, anything. And then there comes the fellow across the street with a white cane, or a lady pushing a child in a little what do you call them? Child
Stroller.
Stroller. Thank you. And so all of this is madness. And what is now possible is to change that whole paradigm, and it's coming. I think that's what I have to say.
Thank you. Mr. Mike, do you believe your system, PodWay, will be sustainable for emerging economy like Bangladesh, India, or Malaysia, or Indonesia? And what's your concluding remarks for today's session? Mr. Mike.
Yeah, if you've been overseas and you've seen the transportation system, I think a lot of us have a U.S. perspective where we have these roadways with lane markings and people stay in them, and you have these large vehicles. And the rest of the world doesn't do that. And you're talking about in the United States, the median income is for a household is $75,000. And for many of the countries that we're doing these systems in, the median household income is less than $5,000, sometimes $2,000 a year. And so when you have an electric vehicle that's $5,000, that's not possible. But when you have a $5,000 vehicle that's replacing 30 electric vehicles, each costing $50,000 or $60,000, you have a 300-to-1 cost advantage. The summary is that the cost will win. If you have the lowest levelized cost of transportation, that will win globally. And it will win in any particular area because you have network effects, just like you have the network effects with the roadways. So that's why we're going to have essentially walking, bicycling, and podways, because it's the lowest risk, lowest cost, highest capacity, and it solves all the issues that people now have with transportation, both within cities, between islands, for trucks, why would you take anything else if you can give people what they love? Because we know 95% of all of our trips are in a private car. So give people what they love about a private car, just without any of the negative effects or externalities, and make it where it can be privately financed, where now our government doesn't have to finance it. And you're going to have a dramatic shift, a very fast shift. And it's not anything that people are expecting. People are saying like, oh, it's a multimodal future. I'm sure they thought that about a lot of things, and they're usually wrong. It's not a multimodal world. It's when things have the cost models, and when you have the network effects, they become singular modes very quickly. So that's what you're going to see.
Thank you. Mr. David Smith, what's your concluding remarks?
Sharif, once again, thank you so much for letting me be part of this. I've listened to the presentation, and I do believe that pods are going to be part of the solution set. I've also have been looking at some of the other statistics globally, and actually I agree with what Mike said, is that oftentimes we take a North American perspective on this. And, I'm often reflected back on places I travel and do things. I mean, my trips when I go to Thailand, I love looking at some of the Thailand infrastructure projects. The transportation path from the airport to downtown Bangkok is amazing to me, even wearing my United States filter. It's a 7-layer transportation infrastructure in a common right-of-way built vertically, with different levels for mass transportation, different levels for commercial transportation, different levels for individual transportation and things. And they've done a remarkable job. I agree, since the majority of the people on this program today are from California, that you look at some of the infrastructure, particularly in California, like the 405 in Los Angeles, and it's a total disaster. And a pod transportation that could replace setting for 5 hours in the traffic on the 405 would be a great advancement. Uh, Donald, I like what you say around Palo Alto and around the Stanford community. Is love walking in that community. Unfortunately, though, I also see that trying to use mass transit in there is a challenge, even though it's a fantastic community, and I can begin to use that. I also know, though, that when I just put on uh, the type of projects I've worked on around the world, and looking at roadmaps and future trends and everything else, I can apply my rules there. I can look at demographics. I can look at statistics. And it's going to be a very interesting future. Do I think pods are going to have a part of it? Yes, I do. Uh, but I will go back to what I said. I really do believe it will be a hybrid solution. And I see all of the indicators of that around the world. And just going back just a while ago and looking at some of the current statistics around the world, I would put on my futurist hat and still say the same. I do understand the commercial interest that are being presented today, and uh, if there's enough private money to build these systems, which is why it's being said it will be a private build, then it stands more of a chance of being implemented. But it will be trillions of dollars to install a system like this around the world, and it's going to take some doing to get it done. That's not all going to be private money. So I wish them luck. But Sharif, thank you so much again for letting me be part of this program. You present many different views to the developing world and the developing world as well. And thank you for bringing this type of program to bear.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Ron, what's your concluding remarks?
Well, I I'm in the vortex of Silicon Valley, and I know that in our region, because of our established infrastructure, we will not be the first by any stretch to take this bold step forward. What I see is this technology emerging in Africa and Asia, perhaps in Latin America, where many cities do not have the kind of infrastructure, do not have a high percentage of the population already invested in these big chunky metal machines. And that's where I think this is going to take off. And eventually, Americans in particular, but Europeans and so forth, will come around. But in this particular instance, just like in the early 90s when I was in Mexico City, you had to wait about 2 years to get a landline. You could walk down the street and pick up a cell phone if you had a credit card or some kind of credit worthiness in an hour. And so the landlines disappeared, except in business, and everybody had a cell phone. And so I see that this technology is going to kick off very rapidly. And David, I concur that this is a multi-trillion-dollar expenditure. I'll translate that into a multi-billion-dollar opportunity, multi-trillion-dollar opportunity, because we are going to be transforming in the same process the energy system that is running our cities. Our pod car networks will have a surplus of electricity to share with the neighbors. At our stations, we will provide plug-in for cell phones, charging, small micro mobility solutions, scooters, electric bicycles, and such. And that's the future that I see.
Thank you. So,
Thank
Donald,
you.
what's your concluding remarks?
Well, I kind of want to just finish what I was saying, which is that because of the fact that suburbs and the external regions are actually lose money for the cities, that if pod cars can replace just the economics of building roads, and that's what costs the money, is the roads. And so just the economics of supporting cities makes it just, I agree with what Mike was saying, is that just economically, if it's roads versus pod cars, pod cars are going to win. And so I think that especially in places where roads aren't completely developed and there's a choice, then it'll be, as I said before, it'll be like cell phones. I mean, why go for the thing that's incredibly expensive and you lose money on when you have something else that you can do that's much, much cheaper? And, going back to what David said about, how slow it was, just think of how fast. Does anybody have a landline anymore? I mean, just think of how fast that happened. I mean, they're gone. I mean, nobody has them anymore. I mean, a few people do, but very few people have landlines anymore. And so I want to bring up one interesting thing. Is one of the people I work with, Ron and Andres, and one of the interesting things, one of the people that we work with designed the software for the regional transportation system we have called BART. And I don't have time to get into the complexities of the loading and unloading large trains versus pod cars and things like that. It's kind of an interesting thing. But he also built the first pod car system in the United States. And what happened is that one of the reasons pod cars haven't taken off is because they don't scale well. They get up to a certain size and then they start getting, they cost more per passenger as they grow to an extent where they're not economically feasible anymore. And in the past. And the reason for that is that computers when they first were doing it, were much slower and much more expensive than they are now. I mean, when I first started, I started an internet company back in the 90s, and our server that we bought was $7,000, and we ran a bunch of websites off of this server. And this phone has 2,000 times as much disk space as that server, that $7,000 server that we had in the 90s. So, I mean, the relationship of what we have now to what we have then is just, there's no thing. And so our system, you know, for an example, I mean, other systems might be able to do this. We can have pod cars just a second apart. And so the amount of people that we can get in the pod cars are enormous now. And it's a whole, it's things have really changed. And so I think that it's worth remembering that the technology has been advancing very fast. And so looking at what pod cars have done in the past isn't really an indication of what they can do now. And so I support what everyone else has been saying, is that the idea that we're very tied to the infrastructure of automobiles, but the cost of pod cars is much less, and that's going to be a huge driving force to making pod cars become the preferred mode of transportation. And I want to say one other thing. On Christmas Day, I was hit by a car in a crosswalk. There was no question about it. The insurance money paid me. There was no question whatsoever that he was completely in the wrong. He even admitted it. But you know, these 2,000-pound chunks of metal driving around like where there's people is a very bad idea. And so I'm looking forward to seeing pod cars be the preferred mode of transportation.
Thank you. Mr. Andreas, what's your concluding remarks for today's session?
Thank you, Dr. Sharif. I would just want to come back to you in my concluding remarks to your question about Bangladesh and the developing countries of the world. This whole technology we're talking about, using when the sun shines, the vehicles run. Renewable energy, but energy that's for free. Automated, no drivers, low cost. You deploy it on the existing road infrastructure. You don't have to go and create new right of way. You do it grade separated, so it's safe, even though people can still move around. That is absolutely made for the developing economies of the world. It's like Ron said, the developed economies will follow what's happening in the developing economies as far as this is concerned. I'm not from the States, I'm not from Europe, I am from Africa. I don't look like African, but I am from Africa. And I developed this technology, that our version of this technology, specifically aimed at Africa and the developing parts of the world, where no subsidization is paid and people can travel for less than $1 a day. That's what we are trying to achieve. And the only way we could get to that cost was to follow pod cars on existing right of ways, grade separated using solar energy. So that is the future, and it's going to be the future in the developing economies more than the developed economies of the world. I firmly believe that, and it's already happening. The first cities are actually starting to deploy it, not in Europe and the States, but actually in Africa and Asia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining today's session. From today's session, definitely our policymakers, our government agency and corporation, and especially the Public-Private Partnership Authority, they may understand how sustainable transportation infrastructure can be developed by this team, and hopefully through this process we can solve this complex problem. Thank you, Mr. Andreas. Thank you, Mr. Donald, and thank you, Professor Ron, for your continuous support for World Dynamic Development Forum. Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.
Bye.